Okay, so anytime somebody uses, this is the Stewart theory, to state that someone is incorrect from the traditional acid-base balance view of things, is incorrect because this is only a theory. Okay, it has never been proven correct via experiments. In fact, in experimentation, it has been proven incorrect. So essentially, Stewart's theory, which basically is suggesting that liberating protons in the body cannot alter the pH because the hydrogen ions and the bicarbonate are dependent variables. Okay, so in other words, if you give the body more protons, it's not going to make the blood more acidic. Or if you give bicarbonate, it's not going to alter the bicarbonate level in the body because of these levers. This is incorrect, by the way. This has been shown to be incorrect experimentally, and Kurtz in 2008 put out a large review paper on the inaccuracies of this theory. And I'll go through some of those in that paper. But to state that you cannot change the pH of the body by dumping in more protons, that doesn't even take into account the physical limitations of the lungs and the kidneys to basically neutralize the protons in the body. As well, conversely, if you give too high amounts of bicarbonate, you can over-alkalinize the body. They have to be large amounts, but in other words, this Stewart theory isn't even taking into account the physical constraints of the kidneys and the lungs to handle acid and alkaline loads, which there are physical constraints as well. So you can't say that adding protons or adding bicarbonate isn't going to change their levels because of these independent variables and that these are dependent. You cannot say that. This has been proven wrong experimentally. So for example, if you infuse the body with hydrochloric acid, aka you dump in more protons, it will 100% induce metabolic acidosis. This has been shown in animal studies. In human studies, if you give ammonium chloride and you increase the proton concentration in the body, it induces clinically significant metabolic acidosis. And again, in human clinical studies, if you give a high enough dietary acid load, aka a high animal protein diet, the concentration of protons absolutely goes up in steady state and the concentration of bicarbonate does go down. Now, not to the degree of ingesting ammonium chloride in humans or not to the degree of infusing hydrochloric acid, but you cannot say that a proton load or a bicarbonate load will not alter the proton concentration or the bicarbonate concentration in humans. That is incorrect. Experimental studies clearly show that high protein diets increase the steady state proton concentration and reduce the steady state bicarbonate concentration because of the limited capacity of the kidneys to excrete hydrogen ions and the limited capacity of the lungs to handle acid loads. And you would know this too if you understood that if you just go down to chronic kidney stage 2, which is a GFR of 60 to 89, these individuals become acidic because they can no longer handle just a typical normal acid load. So if you eat a very high acid load, even if you have normal kidney function, you slowly start to accumulate hydrogen ions because you're already on the cusp of the kidneys just barely being able to handle a normal dietary load, where if the GFR goes down a little bit, all of a sudden you are starting to accumulate these and becoming significantly acidic. And that's because of, again, I said the physical constraints. Lennon and Lemon group had showed that the physical constraints of excreting acid is about 40 milliequivalents per day of acid. And the typical net acid excretion on a normal westernized diet is somewhere between 50 and 100 milliequivalents, exceeding that value. So when you start excreting more than 40 milliequivalents of acid per day, for every 2.5 milliequivalents of acid above that, the body retains 1 milliequivalent. So there are constraints again, and we can see this in clinical studies looking at high protein diets. Now, some of this is hidden because there are buffers in the blood, like albumin and hemoglobin, which can bind hydrogen ions and try to normalize and keep the blood in a normal range, even though, as I had showed previously in my other video, that by the time you're 70, bicarbonate actually does go to a significantly clinically low value, below 22 milliequivalents per liter by the time you're 70 in normal healthy people. In other words, again, this isn't taking into account the physical constraints of consuming a high dietary acid load for a very long period of time with a slow accumulation in the background setting of a limited capacity to neutralize acid by the lungs and the kidneys. So this cannot prove anything incorrect in regards to acid-base balance because it is based on epistemology, not on clinical evidence, and it's been proven incorrect by experimental data. Okay, now let's discuss the review paper by Kurtz that was published in 2008. Stewart introduced his theory in 1978. This is a nice critique of the Stewart approaches. It also critiques a little bit of the bicarb-centered approach as well, but you're going to see that by the conclusion of this, it's going to be very obvious why the Stewart, again, it is a theory, is incorrect. So we'll go through this rather quickly to not waste too much time. This is the two basically competing views, the bicarbonate-centered approach, which, the Henderson-Hasselbalch equation, and then you have the Stewart-strong ion equation. So let's try to make some sense of this. So according to the Lowry-Bronsted acid-base theory, based on the transfer of protons between proton donors, aka acids, and proton acceptors, aka bases, changes in either the mass balance of protons or the donation or release of a proton between a donor-acceptor pair within a given compartment are responsible for an alteration in the proton concentration. Okay, Stewart's formulation is challenging these assertions. Okay, so this is just showing you basically where Stewart's formulation is kind of deriving from. Essentially, Stewart termed sodium minus chloride the strong ion difference, or SID, which is you're going to see SID throughout this paper, and put forward the concept that this parameter was the determinant of the proton concentration. Okay, accordingly, in his formulation, ions were fixed charges playing a central role in the determination of the proton concentration. Since ions with a fixed charge were always present at the concentration at which they were originally added, remained completely dissociated and not participate in the reactions in the solution, they were defined by Stewart as independent variables, which we've heard some people consistently say, independent variables, right? Taking into consideration the charge, the law of mass action, and equilibrium constraints in a compartment such as blood containing bicarbonate and non-bicarbonate buffer, Stewart derived a fourth-order polynomial equation depicting the proton concentration as a function of the strong ion dissociation, right? And we've seen these terms, the partial pressure of CO2, the strong ion difference, A top. These parameters were defined as the key independent variables for the mechanistic control, apparently, of protons. And bicarbonate also was assumed to be a dependent variable, apparently. In protons, a dependent variable. But they were not explicitly depicted in the equation. It is clear from our analysis thus far that there currently exists a fundamental difference between the proponents of the Stewart and traditional formulas in mechanistically accounting for the changes in protons in an aqueous solution. Okay, we know that. Bronsted and Lowry changed the focus of acid-base chemistry by stating that the key player was the chemical potentiation of the hydrogen ion. This insight removed strong cations and strong anions from the underlying conceptual framework of acid-base chemistry, with the implication that neither ion was primarily responsible for the changes in pH. Rather, it is when sodium is added to the solution in the form of a salt accompanied by a bicarbonate that can bind protons at the initial pH value that the pH can change to a new value. Similarly, chloride in the form of HCl is actually a base in the Bronsted-Lowry terminology, since at a specific pH it is a proton acceptor. After a thorough discussion of the historic reasons, clinical chemists considered sodium a base and chloride an acid. Relman went on to discuss how this terminology entirely neglects the central position of the hydrogen ion in acid-base reactions. Christensen then went on to write, lack of understanding of the properties of the bicarbonate ion in the past has perhaps misdirected attention to the sodium ion. This prescient analysis foreshadows, in some sense, the current issues in the literature as they relate to the Stewart framework. Okay? Since he had prior to his quantitative analysis defined bicarbonate hydroxide ions as dependent variables, these species could not therefore partake mechanistically in causing changes in proton ions, and therefore were not explicitly referred to in his final equations. Accordingly, Stewart concluded that the hydrogen ion was a function of the independent variables, as we've already discussed before. The question as to which variable is independent or dependent is not mathematical, but rather experimental, empirical in nature. If by experimentation one determines that x is the independent variable, by convention the dependence of y on x is indicated by an equation via this form. Importantly, very often in experimental science, the ultimate goal is determining which variable is independent or dependent, is to uncover mechanisms for particular observation. These considerations emphasize that to categorize a specific term in an equation as an independent or dependent variable, one must have obtained mechanistic experimental data. In the absence of empirical data, one must at a minimum have a mechanistic model that accounts for the observed phenomenon in which to base one's dependent and independent variable categorization. As a justification for his analysis, Stewart used epistemological, just knowledge and theory arguments, rather than experimental results, when he stated that independent variables are imposed on a system from the outside and are not affected by the equations which govern the system, nor by the changes in the system, nor by each other. Dependent variables are internal to the system. Their values are determined by the system equations and by the values of the independent variables. It was on this basis that he defined protons, bicarbonate, etc. as dependent variables, and the others as independent. As stated by proponents of the Stewart formulation, all other variables in the system, such as pH, bicarbonate, are dependent and cannot be changed primarily or individually. They change all simultaneously only if one or more of the independent variables change. As a corollary, Stewart parted ways with the traditional acid-base theory by stipulating that proton movements into or out of a solution do not provide quantitative explanations for changes in protons, do not determine the value of the concentration of protons, and by themselves cannot explain changes in it. Therefore, according to Stewart's theory, again, this is a theory. A theory can never prove something incorrect. Neither the whole body changes in the mass balance and intercompartmental flux of protons or bicarbonate, nor buffer reactions in a solution that consume or release protons can mechanistically result in changes, according to his theory. Moreover, Kovalchuk and this author here, well, I guess that wasn't important, so I started highlighting it, but didn't. Okay, so first, the Stewart's view is epistemological. It is not evidenced based on actual clinical experiences. So first, epistemological arguments ought not to be the basis for a mechanistic understanding of acid-base chemistry. Okay, again, showing that Stewart is a theory and it's based on opinion. Second, Stewart's epistemology is questionable since there is no basis in statistical theory for his contention that independent variables are imposed on a system from the outside and are not affected by the equations which govern the system, nor by the changes in the system, nor by each other, and that dependent variables are internal to the system. Their values are determined by the system equations and by the values of the independent variables. Okay, so again, this is basically saying it's a theory and here's why it's wrong. First, Stewart contended that internal protons, bicarbonate, proton transfer reactions could not be responsible for changes in protons in the same system. Despite this, as discussed, the equilibrium rate constants for proton transfer reactions involving bicarbonate are explicit parameters in Stewart's equation. Furthermore, although Stewart felt it was justified to omit bicarbonate explicitly from his formulation as it was classified as a dependent variable, CO2, the proton donor, was not excluded as it was defined as an independent. This distinction is unclear given that the concentration of both bicarbonate and CO2 are altered by the changes in mass balance and partake in the same aqueous proton transfer reaction. So the proton-CO2 reaction can per se generate or consume CO2 without a change in whole body CO2 mass balance. In this sense, the CO2 concentration is also a dependent variable, making its assignment as an independent variable according to the Stewart formulation confusing, aka incorrect. The traditional acid-base physiology, or physiologist, utilizes volatile and non-volatile buffers in acid-base analysis, since these substances are involved in aqueous proton transfer reactions at physiological pH. Moreover, to the traditional acid-base physiologist, SID is a mathematical construct based on electroneutrality considerations rather than a fundamental physicochemical property that is deterministic of acid-base behavior. This simple experiment demonstrates that when changes in SID occur to satisfy the constraints of macroscopic electroneutrality, there is always an associated change in the hydroxide ion or proton ion of equal magnitude. Therefore, the concept that SID changes independently cannot occur based on constraints of electroneutrality. One could also change the SID by the addition or removal of water. Again, however, the value of OH and H would change identically such that, here, and then he puts out this formulation. Can one change SID without a concomitant equation change in OH or H+? In this way, test Stewart's assertions that SID is an independent variable that modulates hydrogen ions. And then they give examples of how this is incorrect. Okay, mechanisms by which strong light can change in a single compartment constrained by that. This is very complex, but I'm going to go into some more reading to kind of explain a little bit more. So suppose that instead of adding protons in chloride or sodium and hydroxide simultaneously to our hypothetical in vitro system, these ions were added separately and that macroscopic electroneutrality was not maintained. By adding these ions individually, one could conceivably in a straightforward way experimentally change SID and OHH plus individually. In fact, this does occur in biological systems. See below for channels on electrogenic ion transporters, where electroneutrality is violated microscopically for a predictable distance from biological membranes. The proton beam experiment is an example of hydrogen flux into an aqueous solution from a source external to the system that, according to the Stewart's formulation, cannot alter the proton significantly. An argument based on epistemological considerations, again, which is not based on fact. The traditional acid-base physiologist would predict that the protons will indeed increase because of the change in the mass balance of protons. Using the following simple example, it can be shown that the concept that changes in SID specify a given proton is incorrect. Okay, stating incorrect, giving the examples. Therefore, the proton can be any value for a given change in SID, and that the proton at equilibrium is only determined by the dissociation constant of water. This holds true regardless of the absolute value. Effects of the ionic strength. There are several fallacies with the argument that the Stewart or Constable equations are a more accurate tool for calculating hydrogen ions compared with the equations depicting protons as a function of individual buffer pairs, such as the Henderson-Hasselbalch equation. First, in a complex solution such as plasma containing multiple buffer pairs, any of the individual buffer pairs, such as these, and the respective equilibrium constants, can be used to calculate protons rather than measure directly with a pH electrode. Right, let's see here. Unlike the detailed molecular analysis of kinetics and intermediate complexes involved in proton transfer reactions between an acid and a base, the Stewart formulation lacks a molecular/theoretical basis whereby the charge difference between strong ions per se is able to alter the protons at equilibrium. However, it is clear that unlike Stewart's formulation, the electrons that are being added via cathode or removed via an anode from the solution are partaking in the reaction, and in this sense do not stimulate a change in the net ionic charge as formulated by Stewart. Despite this difference, it should be pointed out that these oxidation reduction reactions are examples of reactions that, according to the Stewart formulation, are internal to the system and accordingly ought not to be responsible for the change in protons that is measured at each electrode. So basically they're giving this example that shows that Stewart's ideas are incorrect. Stewart's formulation does not provide a readily apparent mechanistic understanding of the proton changes detected at each electrode. Similarly, an explanation for the mechanistic working of fuel cells and proton transfer changes in electron transport chain is lacking. In other words, his theories can't even explain electron transport chain reactions regarding proton movements. The traditional acid-base physiologist would question this formulation, emphasizing that transported hydrogen ions combine with bicarbonate and offer buffer anions. SID does not contribute to the determination of a specific proton value, and water dissociation equilibrium reaction cannot alter the net charge of unfixed ions. Then there's other examples too. Various proteins belonging to these gene families transport bicarbonate either in exchange for chloride. Mutations in these proteins result in abnormal bicarbonate transport across the epithelia. According to the traditional acid-base theory, defective bicarbonate transport basically in the proximal tubules leads to renal tubular acidosis. Okay, and mutations in that can lead to congenital chloride diarrhea with subsequent retention of bicarbonate and metabolic alkalosis. The systematic acid-base changes in these disorders are caused by defective bicarb transport. Okay, according to Stewart's equation, bicarb cannot change systematic acid-base transporters, but you affect the bicarb transport, and it does change the systemic acid-base balance. Okay, but it's not supposed to, according to the Stewart law. The production of hydrogen ions and bicarb by metabolism is an integral component of acid-base balance. In an average North American diet, metabolism of the absorbed dietary constituents generates protons and bicarbonate, as I've explained many times. Alterations in the quantity of protons and bicarbonate produced can have a marked impact on the level of blood bicarbonate in individuals with normal and compromised renal function, which I have shown in previous studies as well. In other words, this is proving that Stewart's theory is incorrect, because the dietary components, especially in a high animal protein, as I'll show you here, leads to an acid load. Okay? Important dietary substances whose metabolism leads to proton generation include the neutral sulfur-containing amino acids methionine and cysteine, which I've mentioned ad nauseum, which are converted to sulfate and protons. And that I've ad nauseum mentioned the cationic amino acids, lysine, arginine, and some histidine, which again liberate the acid, the hydrogen ions in the body. It's estimated that the net total hydrogen load, proton load generated by these sources approximates 200 milliequivalents per day. Substances which generate bicarbonate consume protons. They include glutamate and aspartate, which I've mentioned, and citrate, gluconate, acetate, malate, and lactate, which I've also mentioned. Approximately 150 milliequivalents a day of bicarbonate is generated from the metabolism of these substances. Therefore, there is a net proton generation each day of 50 milliequivalents. However, this can go much higher in carnivores, which it does. Typically, in a carnivore, you are going to have 150 to 250 milliequivalents. Now, the Stewart theory has never proven that generating and excreting 150 to 250 milliequivalents of acid is okay and won't lead to acid retention, whereas experiments from Lennon and Lemon in balance studies giving dietary acid loads has shown the limitations of doing such and that there is acid retention. Okay, so Stewart's theories can't take into account actual balance studies that have given a high dietary acid load, showing that there is limited capacity of the kidneys to handle that acid load, and showing that the pH goes down, that the protons in steady state go up, and that bicarbonate does go down. In what is now relevant to those who support the Stewart formulation, Christian pointed out years ago that if we limit ourselves to the cation-anion point of view, it will be impossible to interpret the metabolic production and consumption of protons when there is no net change in fixed ions in the body. Moreover, it is known that the metabolic production of sulfate is acidifying, and components of the cation-anion or acid approach would potentially attribute the acidifying properties to an increase in fixed anions. However, as Christensen stated, one cannot readily imagine why sulfate would be more acidifying if not quite all is excreted. It remains to be explained why the cellular machinery to acidify the lumen would utilize ATP to secrete protons, when according to the Stewart formulation, proton flux per se has no effect on gastric acidity. The coupling of potassium channel flux to the proton potassium ATPase activity has no net effect on SID, but results in a loss of ATP. Given that according to the Stewart formulation, it is the secretion of chloride that lowers the SID, thereby acidifying the lumen, one might ask why nature didn't simply couple the transport of chloride to ATP hydrolysis, rather than the utilization of three separate processes, each of which can change the SID and alter lumen proton concentration. In addition, although according to the Stewart formulation, internal proton transfer reactions cannot per se be responsible for changes in proton concentration, it is the internal proton transfer reaction that generates intracellular bicarb via proton potassium ATPase mediated proton efflux that drives the basolateral chloride influx and subsequent luminal chloride secretion that causes a decrease in luminal SID. In the absence of the intracellular proton transfer reaction generating bicarbonate, basolateral to luminal transcellular chloride secretion would not occur. Given that according to the Stewart formulation, it is the secretion of chloride that lowers the SID, thereby acidifying the lumen, similar to in the stomach, one might ask why nature did not simply couple the transport of chloride to the ATP hydrolysis. In addition, although according to the Stewart formulation, internal proton transfer reactions cannot per se be responsible for changes in protons as in the parietal cells, it is the internal proton transfer reaction that generates intracellular bicarb via proton efflux that drives basolateral chloride influx and subsequent luminal chloride secretion that causes the decrease. In the absence of the intracellular proton transfer reaction generating bicarb, that basolateral to luminal transcellular chloride secretion would not occur unless chloride secretion were active. Therefore, as in the stomach, according to the Stewart formulation, the secretion of protons consumes ATP without being directly involved in luminal acidification. Several questions remains for the proponents of the Stewart formulation, specifically if an internal proton transfer reaction is not involved, by what mechanism chemically does the decrease in lactate result in an increase in blood pH and bicarbonate? Second, SID is not increasing as lactate is metabolized because of a process imposed on a system from the outside. All independent variables are initially unchanged by the addition of sodium lactate to the system. Therefore, there should be no mechanism for any dependent variables to change. Importantly, the lack of a mechanistic basis to justify the use of Stewart formulation is critical. In this regard, the hypothesis that in a given compartment SID, a mathematical construct and not a physical-chemical property, mechanistically influences protons to maintain electrical neutrality has no experimental basis. Let's read this again. Importantly, the lack of mechanistic basis to justify the use of Stewart formulation is critical. In this regard, the hypothesis that in a given compartment, SID, strong ion difference, a mathematical construct and not a physical-chemical property, mechanistically influences protons to maintain electroneutrality has no experimental basis. Those valuing the Stewart formulation would be wise to follow Occam's razor, which asserted that entities are not to be multiplied without necessity. Translated, this means that the equations one utilizes should not include only those terms that are necessary to characterize the underlying phenomenology mechanistically. Although the pursuit of simplicity can sometimes be misguided regarding the current state of our understanding of acid-base phenomenology, the moral of the story appears to be rather straightforward. If it's not broken, don't fix it.